Good afternoon. My name is Giovanni Machocha, and I am talking to you from beautiful Santa Barbara in California, where I currently reside. And this presentation will discuss the treatment of depression in Chinese medicine with both acupuncture and Chinese herbs. Depression is a Western disease category which has no direct equivalent in Chinese medicine. But Chinese medicine with both acupuncture and herbs is very effective in treating this problem. And this is probably, from the psychiatric illnesses point of view, the most common problem in clinical practice, together with anxiety. And the two often occur together, the depression and the anxiety. Let's look briefly at the categories of mental illness in Chinese medicine, which are listed on this slide. And interestingly, three of these, Bai He, Zhang Zhao, and Mei He Qi, derive from the book from the Jingui Yalue, which was written by Zhang Junjing in the Jin dynasty around 200 AD. So they're very ancient, which seems to show that stress is not a modern disease, but it existed in ancient China as well. And the point I want to make in looking at these diseases from the Chinese point of view is that there isn't a single Chinese disease equivalent to depression. But in order to treat depression, we need to refer to 3, 4, or even 5 of these Chinese diseases. And the first one is called Bai He, which is from the Jingui Yalue. And that also, the description of that disease more or less corresponds to depression, what we would call depression. And it's treated with a very simple formula, as we will see, composed of only 2 herbs, Bai He and Zhemu. The second one is the one that most closely corresponds to depression. It's called Yu Zheng. And the Chinese word Yu has an interesting meaning because it has 2 meanings. It means both depression and stagnation. And most Chinese books will say that what we call depression is Yu Zheng in Chinese medicine. I do not agree with this view because, as I said a moment ago, what we call depression corresponds to 3, 4, or 5 of these Chinese diseases. Zhang Zhao corresponds more to anxiety than depression, and that's also from the same book, the Jingui Yalue. And the Mei He Qi is the famous plum stone syndrome. The sensation, the patient has a sensation of obstruction in the throat, as if it was a plum stone in the throat, which is often related to liver qi stagnation. But as we will see, it actually involves qi stagnation of other organs as well, especially heart and lungs. If we look further down the list, Dian Kuang is a more serious psychiatric illness, roughly corresponding to bipolar disease or manic depression. So I would say that if we want to ask to what Chinese diseases does depression correspond to, I would say it's actually 5 of them. And the first 5, Bai He, Yu Zheng, Zhang Zhao, Mei He Qi, and Xin Ji Zheng Chun, which means palpitations and anxiety. And this is summarized in this slide. So these are the 5 Chinese diseases which correspond to depression, and that means that we can use the formula for those patterns in the treatment of depression. And I put Yu Zheng there at the top because it's the one probably the most closely corresponds to depression, but not the only one. A depressive illness is defined in Western medicine as a change in mood that is lasting, because changes in mood are a common everyday experience that everyone goes through. So it only becomes depression when it's long-lasting over a period of weeks, months, or years. And as you can see in this slide, there is a change in behavior, in attitude, in thinking, and also physiological functioning. So the definition of depression is both quantitative and qualitative. As you can see here, depression is probably the psychiatric problem that we will see most often in practice. It accounts for 35–40% of all psychiatric illness, and very often combined with anxiety. The two are often combined together. And the highest incidence is in that age group, 55 to 60. In Western psychiatry, they distinguish between endogenous depression, which has no apparent cause, and exogenous depression, or reactive depression, which has a cause that usually has to do with loss, bereavement, the loss of a partner, of a child. From the Chinese point of view, I don't think that this distinction is that important. And we would, in Chinese medicine, we would consider every type of depression as having an aspect of both endogenous and reactive. These are the main symptoms of depression. As you can see, anxiety is right at the top there, so the two are very often combined. Notice also the loss of interest, loss of self-esteem. And I have highlighted two of them where it says Shen obstructed. And I'll explain in a moment why I've done that. So there is a feeling of derealization, depersonalization, which for me, from the Chinese point of view, would indicate that the Shen is obstructed. And when the Shen is obstructed, there is a certain loss of insight. And also disorders of perception would indicate obstruction of the Shen. So depression as a whole, I would characterize from the Chinese point of view as the Shen being depressed or deficient. But in some cases, there is also an obstruction of the Shen. And we will see what that means and what that means in treatment. Of course, in addition to these symptoms, there will be many physical symptoms, especially to do with digestion very often. Palpitations, breathing, very many physical symptoms. And one particular Western author who is an authority on depression is Bowlby, and he relates depression very much to a loss, and also to events in childhood. So before we talk about the treatment of depression, I'd like to talk about the nature of the Shen in Chinese medicine. And we will see this in this slide here. So on the top there, we have the character for Shen. And that character is made of two parts. On the left, it is this. And this is a contracted version of that. So basically on the left, there is that. And on the right, there is this. So let's see what those mean. This part on the left is She. And look at the meaning of it. Influx from heaven, auspicious or inauspicious signs by which the will of heaven is known to mankind. It also sometimes indicated the altar for sacrifices. So it's something spiritual, pertaining to heaven from the Chinese point of view. And a good word, a nice word that I would use in the English language is something numinous, something pertaining to the gods, as the ancient Romans would have used that word, numinous, in relation to their gods. So something spiritual, influx from heaven. And I should stress here that when we write heaven there with the capital H, we're doing that from a Chinese point of view. Nothing whatsoever to do with the Christian concept of heaven. So it's something spiritual, something subtle, something numinous, which gives you an idea of the nature of Shen. On the right, we have this character here, which is pronounced Shen. And notice what it means: to state, to express, to explain, to stretch, to extend. And that, in my opinion, highlights a very important characteristic of the nature of the Shen. I.e., the Shen is what allows us to relate to other people, to relate to the world, to express, to stretch, to extend. And in my opinion, in depression, there is a disharmony of that. There is a lack of that relating, extending, stretching, extending towards others, which causes this feeling of isolation and depression. So although the part on the right, Shen, is often said to be purely phonetic, it is more than just phonetic. It also has a meaning. And in fact, it has a very important meaning. So the Shen is something like that: spiritual, subtle, immaterial, numinous, that allows us to relate and to extend towards others. There at the top, notice in how many ways you can translate Shen: mind, spirit, consciousness, vitality, expression, soul, energy. And the Western missionaries who went to China used that word, chose that word for the word God. Another very important psychiatrist who wrote a lot about depression is Seligman, and he relates depression a lot to childhood. And notice what he says there: this person is likely to have had the bitter experience of never having attained a stable and secure relationship with his parents. Notice that, relationship with his parents. That's the Shen that we just talked about. These childhood experiences result in his developing a strong bias to interpret any loss he may later suffer as yet another of his failures to make or maintain a stable affectional relationship. Again, there will be a disharmony of the Shen, extending, relating nature of the Shen. These are the symptoms of what is called in Western psychiatry major depressive syndrome, and which are usually an alarm bell in Western psychiatry, in major depressive syndrome, because there is always the danger of suicide. And notice also that these people may have morbid thoughts of death, not necessarily suicidal, but morbid thoughts of death. So let's look at the Chinese view of depression, and starting from Yu Zheng. That's the character for Yu, and it's an interesting word because it means stagnation, but it also means mental depression, which would seem to suggest that depression is always due to stagnation. But it is not, and that's something I would like to stress today. In the beginning stages, yes, there is usually always some stagnation, because emotional stress, the first effect of emotional stress is some stagnation, but that's only in the beginning stages. And a very important milestone in the pathology of depression in Chinese medicine is that by Zhu Danxi of the Yuan dynasty, 1300, who related Yu Zheng to the 6 stagnations. So he stressed very much the stagnation. Stagnation of qi, of blood, dampness, phlegm, heat, and food. And he formulated a very important formula for this called UAG1, which we're going to discuss in a moment, which is one of the most important formula for depression from qi stagnation. And this is the description of Yuzheng from a modern textbook of Chinese medicine. These are the manifestations. Notice how there's many manifestations of qi stagnation. The feeling of oppression of the chest, distension, outbursts of anger, the famous feeling of obstruction in the throat. So these are my comments on the Chinese book's approach to depression. And the pathology of Yuzheng is very much centered on qi stagnation, which is, in my opinion, as I said, not the case. And Yuzheng is identified with the qi derangement deriving from emotions, which is certainly the case. Anger, worry, sadness. And in Chinese books, in modern Chinese books, or also ancient Chinese books, there is no concept of the autobiographical self, of the self as a narrative, or the fact that the person may suffer from depression due to childhood influences. That's absent in Chinese medicine. And this is the summary of the pathology of Yuzheng from modern Chinese books. As you can see, there is liver qi stagnation, there is spleen deficiency, the heart loses nourishment, and stagnation of the zang qi. However, it is true that emotional stress, the first effect of emotional stress is qi stagnation, but after that, many other pathologies occur. Qi stagnation leads to heat, heat can lead to fire, heat can injure yin, so it leads to yin deficiency, the spleen becomes deficient, and that can lead to phlegm. So there's a complex pathology. And depression can manifest with any of those patterns, not just qi stagnation. And this slide here summarizes the pathology, and it's actually, in practice, more complicated than this. Notice here in the beginning, emotional stress causes usually qi stagnation, and often both qi deficiency and stagnation. So it affects qi first. So that's interesting. You can't say that a certain emotion causes phlegm or a certain emotion causes dampness. They may cause that, but only after a certain stage of going through qi stagnation. Notice here, one of the first effects of qi stagnation is heat. That's why the tip of the tongue becomes red. In emotional stress, it always manifests with heat. The tip of the tongue becomes red. It doesn't become pale. Because qi stagnation frequently gives rise to heat. Notice how many errors lead to phlegm. Heat can condense fluids and lead to phlegm. Qi stagnation, when qi is not moving, fluids are not transformed, it can give rise to phlegm. Qi deficiency of the spleen can give rise to phlegm. Blood stasis can aggravate phlegm. So phlegm is a very complex pathology influenced by many, many different factors. And it is often seen in depression. And phlegm is also what may cause what I call obstruction of the Shen. Then heat can give rise to fire. Fire burns the yin. That gives rise to empty heat. Qi deficiency and qi stagnation can lead to blood stasis. So this is a summary of the pathology of the derangement of qi and blood deriving from emotions. which is what happens in depression. So I stress depression can manifest with any of those patterns or a combination of those patterns, not just qi stagnation. And usually in Chinese books, these are the patterns mentioned for depression. On the left, we have full patterns, qi stagnation, heat, or qi phlegm. On the right, empty patterns, heart deficiency, spleen and heart blood deficiency, heart and kidney yin deficiency, and kidney yang deficiency. In practice, there is always a combination of shu and she patterns, empty and full patterns. For example, qi stagnation with spleen and heart blood deficiency, or kidney yang deficiency with qi phlegm, etc. There is always a combination of patterns. So all emotions, some emotions lead to qi stagnation, like anger, guilt, and worry, and some more to qi deficiency, like sadness, grief, and shock. But those emotions that lead to qi deficiency also lead to some qi stagnation. For example, sadness affects lungs and heart. Lung qi becomes deficient in the chest, so it doesn't circulate well, it doesn't move well, so that leads to some stagnation as well. So those emotions, like sadness, grief, and shock, may cause a combination of deficiency and stagnation. Before talking about patterns, I'd like to talk about the relationship between Shen and Hun, which in my opinion is crucial in understanding depression from the Chinese point of view. So the Shen is the Shen of the heart. What is the Hun? Briefly, the Hun resides in the liver. In English, I call it the ethereal soul, which is another level of consciousness. It's responsible not so much for rational thinking or the cortical thinking, but is responsible for all those things mentioned there: inspiration, creativity, ideas, plans, life dreams, aspirations. For example, when you decided to study Chinese medicine, that desire comes from the Hun rather than the Shen. And this was expressed in ancient Chinese books as the coming and going of the Hun. The Hun is always moving. What does it mean moving? Searching. It comes and goes. It gives the Shen that movement. We just mentioned a moment ago that one of the natures of the Shen is that of relating, extending. In order to do that, the Shen needs that movement of the Hun. And by the way, the Hun is also responsible for artistic inspiration. Artistic inspiration comes from the Hun rather than the Shen. So the Shen and the Hun work together and have to be integrated and balanced. The Hun likes searching, movement, coming and going, but that movement has to be somewhat controlled by the Shen, somewhat restrained and integrated in the general psyche. And I've got some diagrams to show a pathology of the Hun. So in this slide here, we have the normal relationship between Shen and Hun. That's why these two arrows are the same. So the Hun gives the Shen that movement, ideas, inspirations, life dreams, which is essential for the Shen extending, as we've seen. And the two work together. But the Shen needs to control it to a certain extent and integrate it in the general psyche. So this slide here illustrates the normal relationship between Shen and Hun. And in this slide here, I illustrate the pathology of the Hun when the movement is deficient. The Hun is not moving enough, is not giving that Shen that movement, which is essential in relationships, extending, life dreams, aspiration, i.e. the person is depressed. So in my opinion, in every depression, whatever the pattern, as we've seen, full or empty, there is a pathology of the Hun. The movement of the Hun is deficient and it needs to be stimulated. We have two separate pathologies here. If you notice here, we have a dotted line which indicates that the movement of the Hun is deficient. Hun coming and going not enough. The person is depressed. On the other side, the movement of the Hun is normal, but notice the arrow from the Shen. The Shen is over-controlling it. The result is the same as depression, but from a different reason, because of the over-control of the Shen. And I've illustrated that with a plant that is wilting from the lack of movement of the Hun. And in my opinion, I stress, this is a pathology of all types of depression. Whatever the pattern, full or empty, we need to stimulate the movement of the Hun. We'll see how we do that. By the way, the opposite situation, it's not illustrated here, but the opposite situation, when the movement of the Hun is excessive. This slide here illustrates the situation when the movement of the Hun is deficient and the person is depressed. When the movement of the Hun is excessive, there is mania, manic behavior, that you see in bipolar disease. It will be the opposite pole of depression, from excessive movement of the Hun. There's something else I want to stress before we move on to the actual patterns, is the role of the other five, of the other four in depression. The five spiritual aspects are the Shen and the Hun, the Po in the lungs, the Yi in the spleen, and the Je in the kidneys. And as we will see, they're all involved, to a greater or lesser degree, involved in depression. And the spiritual aspect of the kidneys is the Je. And Je can be translated in many different ways, but one of its meanings is willpower, or determination, or drive, enthusiasm, steadfastness. That's related, all that is related to the kidneys. And, in my opinion, in depression there is a weakening of the Je of the kidneys. And that's why when I treat depression, a person who's been depressed, especially someone who's been depressed for a long time, I always tonify, strengthen the Je of the kidneys, even if there are no kidney deficiency symptoms themselves. And in order to stimulate the Je of the kidneys, I use these 2 points, bladder 23 and bladder 52. And I repeat, I do that even in the absence of a kidney deficiency. Why do I do that? Because in order to get out of the depression, you need that drive, that determination of the Je of the kidneys, especially when the person has been depressed for a long time. It's important, if you look at your modern Chinese books, it's important to make this distinction between Yuzheng and the Dian syndrome, because in my opinion, modern Chinese books misunderstand depression a bit. Dian Quang is roughly bipolar disease or manic depression. Dian is the depressive side of bipolar disease, and Quang is the manic side of bipolar disease. And many Chinese books, when they indicate the symptoms of depression, give the symptoms of Dian. But in my opinion, that is not correct. What we call depression, the depressed patients we see, don't have the symptoms of Dian of Dien Quang, because the symptoms of Dien are always symptoms of obstruction of the Shen, which is usually not the case in depression. So I just wanted to highlight that if you read modern Chinese books, be aware that they often give you the symptoms of Dien as if it was depression, but it's not. It's not correct. So let's look briefly at those ancient Chinese disease categories. The first one is Bai He Ping. Bai He means lily, is a plant, lilium, and Ping means disease. And these are the symptoms. That's from the Jingui Yalue. And as you can see, I personally interpret these symptoms as symptoms of depression. The patient wants to eat but cannot swallow, can't speak, wants to lie in bed but is restless, wants to walk but is soon tired, wants to eat but can't tolerate the smell of food, etc., etc. It says no drugs are able to cure this syndrome. The disease haunts the patient, and the pulse is rapid. And I personally, the formula for this pattern from this book is Bai He Tang, which is only two herbs, Bai He and Zhemu. And I use that formula a lot for depression occurring against a background of Qi and Yin deficiency. And Bai He is a great herb, especially for treating the lungs and for sadness. So I use that a lot. If the person is depressed and crying a lot, sadness from loss, I would always have these two herbs in it. The second Chinese pattern, or Chinese disease, is Zhang Zhao, which is from the same book, the Jingui Yalue. And it's because it's in the gynecology section of the book. Old Chinese books and also modern Chinese books say this is hysteria in women, but it's not. It occurs in both men and women, and basically corresponds to severe anxiety. Zhang Zhao is very difficult to translate because Zhang means the tongue as yin organ, and Zhao means kind of dryness. Basically, it means severe anxiety. The patient suffers from agitation, feels sad, and tends to weep constantly as if she were haunted. Notice this word occurs again. And the formula used for this is also a fantastic formula. It is Gan Mei Ta Cao Tang, which has only three herbs: Fu Xiao Mei, Zhe Gan Cao, and Ta Cao. And I call this formula one of those miraculous formula because you can't really explain its effect from its ingredients. Its ingredients are very, very mild. Fu Xiao Mei is wheat husks, Zhe Gan Cao is licorice, and Ta Cao are black dates. And yet it does work. It has a fantastic effect. I use this formula also a lot, and I use it for both depression and anxiety, occurring against a background of deficiency, usually. And it's called Gan Mei Ta Cao Tang. I will come back to this one. These are the three ingredients of that formula: the wheat husks, black dates, and licorice. And because it contains only three ingredients, I may often combine this formula with another formula. For example, I may be using a yin nourishing formula or a formula to clear heat, but if I think that the problem that person is deriving from depression, I would add these 3 herbs, and they always have an amazing effect. The third disease is that of Meihe-Qi, very famous plum stone syndrome. Interestingly, that's also from the same book, the Jingui Yaolue. And interestingly, in the beginning, it wasn't a plum stone, but the patient has a suffocating feeling as if there was a piece of roast meat stuck in the throat. So the patient has a feeling of obstruction of the throat, which in modern Chinese books always attribute to liver qi stagnation. And I do not agree. I think that the pattern in the original book was actually stagnation of qi of the heart and lungs, not the liver. Heart and lungs in the chest, deriving from sadness, grief, and worry. Those are the 3 emotions related to this Chinese disease. Sadness, grief, and worry, more than anger. And the formula Banxia Hopotang, which is in this, from this book, actually treats lungs, stomach, and heart. These are the ingredients of the formula, only 5. Banxia and Hopo, Zisuye, Fuling, and Shenjiang, which I have in the 3 treasures, and in the 3 treasures is called Open the Heart. So, when I treat depression, I treat the 5 spiritual aspects. Very often, all of them. The first one I treat is the Je of the kidneys, which we already mentioned. Especially in chronic depression, the person needs the Je of the kidneys, the drive, the enthusiasm to get out of the depression. And I treat that primarily with bladder 23 and 52. Even, I repeat, even in the absence of a kidney deficiency. Second, I always treat the Hun. In depression, I stimulate the movement of the Hun. And how do you stimulate the movement of the Hun? With the gallbladder channel primarily. The Hun resides in the liver, the gallbladder is the yang of wood. Being yang would stimulate movement. And I use primarily those 2 points. Gallbladder 40 and bladder 47 on the outer bladder line, which is called Hun Men, the door of the Hun. 3, obviously you need to treat the Shen. You can't treat any mental emotional pattern without treating the Shen of the heart. And those are the 3 main points I use to treat the Shen in mental emotional problems. Do 24, and we'll talk about it later. Ren 15 and Heart 7, those 3 together is a great combination. So we're treating the Je, we're treating the Hun, obviously we're treating the Shen. We're treating the Po. How do we treat the Po? We can't go into detail that now, but the Po is the physical soul which resides in the lungs, and the Po is related to death. So I treat the Po whenever the depressed person has thoughts of death, not necessarily suicidal, but morbid ideation of death. And I use the same points, do 24, and either bladder 13 or do 12 or bladder 42. Notice those 3 points, bladder 13, do 12, and bladder 42 are all related to the lungs, are on the same level. And if you look at the indications there, they all have to do with death. And another point that I would use, which actually are not listed there, would be lung 7, to treat the lungs and treat the Po, especially when there are morbid thoughts of death. Then I treat the Yi. Why do I treat the Yi? Because in depression there is also a decline of mental capacity in thinking, concentration, memory very much is affected. And the yi of the spleen would treat that. And the yi of the spleen is also involved in obsessive thinking, which is also often a feature of depression. And I would use especially bladder 49. Yi she means the shelter of the yi. And gallbladder 13, we do 24. And gallbladder 15 is particularly good for obsessive thoughts. So, going back, we're treating the je of the kidneys, the hun of the liver, the shen of the heart, the po of the lungs, the yi of the spleen. Plus, I treat pericardium and triple burner when there are problems in relationship with triple burner 5, pericardium 7 or 6. And finally, I also stimulate the gallbladder, which we're doing, as you can see, we're doing anyway to stimulate the movement of the hun. The gallbladder is also related to courage and decisiveness, which is also, the lack of which is also a feature of depression. So these are 7 aspects of depression and 7 treatments, which are used in almost every case, in addition to treating the pattern. And we will see the treatment according to pattern very soon. So these are my approach to the treatment of depression, irrespective of the pattern. The etiology of depression, of course, the major etiology is emotional stress. And any of the emotions can be an etiological factor. Chinese books always stress anger a lot. In my opinion, Chinese books overemphasize anger as an emotional cause of disease. Yes, it is common, but especially in the context of depression in Western patients, other emotions are much more important, and especially sadness and grief, these two. Sadness and grief from loss. And sadness and grief affect heart and lungs and restrain the movement of the hun. If we can go back to anger for a moment, I just wanted to say something about anger. In order to diagnose anger as an emotional cause of disease, the pulse must be worry. If the pulse isn't worry, then it's not anger. It's another emotions. Sadness, grief, worry, guilt, shame, anything. Usually worry on both sides. So if the person is depressed and the pulse is full and worry, I would say yes, there is liver qi stagnation, and it probably derives from anger or very often suppressed anger. But I repeat, if the pulse is not worry, then it's not anger. And sadness, grief and worry, as I said, in my opinion, are major emotional causes of depression in the type of patients we see. And as you can see, sadness and grief can give rise to both qi deficiency and qi stagnation. And they affect lungs and heart. So going back to qi stagnation, do not think that all qi stagnation is due to the liver. It's not. Qi stagnation can occur in any organ, and in the context of mental emotional problems, it is extremely common in lungs and heart. Worry is another emotion, which, by the way, worry also leads to yang and qi rising. So qi rising is not always due to anger. It can be due also to worry. Plus, there are other emotions which are never mentioned in Chinese books, which I've added to the list of emotions, and a major one in Western patients is guilt. And guilt is never mentioned in Chinese medicine books, and it's also hardly ever mentioned in Chinese philosophy, the three major philosophies of religions of China, Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, none of these three philosophies has any concept of guilt or sin. So, in my opinion, guilt is very much part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and it is definitely an emotional cause of disease, and it causes qi stagnation. And it affects primarily heart and kidneys. And it also results in the restraining of the movement of the Hun. I want to mention a constitutional trait and the heart crack on the tongue. Both these tongues have what I call a heart crack. If you look at the top one especially, the heart crack is long, it goes from the back to the front. It doesn't have to be right to the very tip, but it could be to there or to there. It is usually narrow. And I call that a heart crack. And what does it mean? It means a constitutional tendency of that person to mental emotional problems. Often family related and also family inherited. Very often when I treat patients from the same family, very often I treat two generations of one family, sometimes three. You can often see this running through families. And it means a constitutional tendency to heart patterns. And the deeper they are, the worse it is. Like, for example, this is very deep. And so is the top one. So if you see a person who's depressed and they have that type of crack, what does it mean? It means two things. One, that the problem is deep-seated. It's due to childhood emotional problems, it's family, running in the family, and it means that the treatment will be more difficult and longer. So if you have two depressed persons, one has a heart crack like that and the other one does not, the one with the heart crack will be more difficult to treat, and that's good to know. Of course, there are other physical etiological factors in depression, and one of them is diet. A diet that leads to blood deficiency, for example, can be a factor in depression, or a diet that leads to phlegm, and that's very common in Western patients. Which diet leads to phlegm? Sugar, too much sugar, sweets, and dairy foods, milk, cheese, butter, cream. All that leads to phlegm, and phlegm is very often a factor in chronic depression. So in this slide we have a list of the patterns that we see in depression. On the left, the full patterns. On the right, empty patterns. And I stress again, very often these are combined. Do not think that we see only one pattern, and do not think that the pattern is either full or empty. If, for example, it's very common or quite possible to have heart and spleen deficiency and qi stagnation and phlegm. You can have any combination of those patterns. So let's talk about the famous liver qi stagnation first, which would be deriving from anger. However, in my opinion, it can also derive from worry, because worry also makes liver yang rise. And that will be the beginning stage of depression. And I repeat, the pulse must be wiry on both sides. If the pulse isn't wiry, then it's not liver qi stagnation, and it's not due to anger. And there is a very famous formula for this, the one in red, from Zhu Danxi of the Yuan dynasty, Yueji 1, which is the formula for depression from liver qi stagnation. In my experience, this pattern more common in more common in men than women. And I have a correspondent of that formula, Yueji 1, in the Three Treasures, called release constraint. And there are other formulae you can use, as you can see in this slide, but the main one is UIG1. And that tongue is an illustration of severe liver qi stagnation. Why do we say liver qi stagnation? Because the sides of the tongue are slightly red. So that's heat in the liver deriving from qi stagnation. And I repeat, this would be the beginning stage of depression. After some time, some months or years, this inevitably gives rise to other patterns. And these are the ingredients of UIG1. And by the way, I also call UIG1 one of those miraculous formula that you can't really explain. Why do I say that? Because it has only 5 ingredients, and none of those ingredients by itself has any mental emotional effect, interestingly. Shenchu, the last one, for example, is a digestive herb. Shanzhe clears heat. Sangju resolves dampness, etc. As you can see, there are 5 herbs for the 6 stagnations. Why 5 for 6? Because Sangju would treat stagnation of dampness and phlegm. So there are 5 herbs for the 6 stagnations. And I call it miraculous because, I repeat, none of those ingredients singly has any mental emotional effect, but together this formula is extremely effective for depression. And it is for what I call full-blown liver qi stagnation, with the pulse all wiry. The second pattern is heart and lung qi stagnation. This is never mentioned in Chinese books. Never. You will never see this in Chinese books because qi stagnation is always related to the liver, and it's not. It's absolutely not. Practically any organ can have qi stagnation, and in the context of mental emotional problems, heart and lung qi stagnation are extremely common. They derive from sadness and grief, often from loss. And the symptoms are very much chest related. There is some shortness of breath, there is palpitations, distension of the chest. It also affects the throat. And an interesting symptom is also sighing. This person with heart and lung qi stagnation will sigh a lot and is depressed. And this is from sadness, grief, or worry. And the formula for this is Ban Xia Hao Po Tang, from the book I mentioned earlier, the Jingui Yalue, which in the 3 treasures I have an equivalent of that called Open the Heart. A very nice formula, very simple formula. And again, for stagnation of qi of heart and lungs. The third pattern is qi turning into heat, and that's extremely common. Qi stagnation, if it persists, gives rise to heat. If it persists for how long? Months or even weeks, qi stagnation turns into heat. And that's when the sides of the tongue become slightly red. And this would also be liver related. And this would be related to anger and worry. But also guilt can cause that. And the formula for this is this one, Danzhe Xiaoyao San, a very famous formula, which I have an equivalent in the 3 treasures called Freeing the Sun. Both those tongues indicate red sides. This one is particularly clear, that one. That's heat in the liver, most probably deriving from liver qi stagnation. And by the way, the heat because there is heat combined with liver qi stagnation, the heat may also cause some anxiety. So this patient will be depressed and anxious. By the way, we mentioned anger as an emotional cause of depression. Very often this anger is suppressed anger or unrecognized anger, or even the patient may not be aware that they're angry. But I repeat, how do we know, how do we think that anger may be involved? If the pulse is wary on both sides. If the pulse is not wary on both sides, then it's not anger. The fourth pattern is a combination of qi stagnation with phlegm, and this may also be related to, could be related to the liver, but also to lungs and heart. And this tongue is a very good example of a tongue indicating phlegm. I relate phlegm to a swollen tongue. When the whole tongue is swollen, to me that indicates phlegm. And phlegm causes the feeling of oppression of the chest. So you could diagnose phlegm only from that, a feeling of oppression of the chest and the tongue like that, a swollen tongue like that. Notice when the tongue is swollen, it changes shape. The normal tongue is kind of long. When it's swollen, notice how it becomes more round, expands on the sides. And phlegm is extremely common, by the way, in the Western patients, in the patients we see. The older they are, the more common phlegm is. And phlegm also obstructs and also would restrain the movement of the Hun, causing depression. And you can use the same formula for this pattern, Ban Xia Hou Bo Tang. And in the 3 treasures you have 3 different formula, but the main one, which is specific for qi stagnation with phlegm, with depression, is Bright Spirit. So Bright Spirit is specific for depression from qi stagnation and phlegm. The 5th full pattern is blood stasis, and you would see this only in very chronic conditions. And usually you would see this only in middle-aged or old patients, not so much in young patients. And how do you know there is blood stasis? From the tongue being purple or partially purple. This tongue is purple all on the left there, in the liver area. And blood stasis derives from usually from qi stagnation. And this type of pattern can derive from anger, but also, in my opinion, in my experience, very common to derive from guilt, as I mentioned earlier. And blood stasis, notice that it also causes agitation. So this person is depressed and anxious and not sleeping well. And the formula for this is Shui Fu Ju Yu Tang for blood stasis in the upper burner. And the equivalent in the 3 treasures is called red stirring. And these are all examples of purple tongue. The one on the right is bluish purple. This one is reddish purple. So these are now the empty patterns, the Shu patterns. The first is deficiency of heart, basically. This is deficiency of heart, qi and blood. From the Chinese name for this is worry injuring Shen, but it's also sadness and grief injuring Shen. So it's basically qi and blood deficiency of the heart, causing sadness and depression. The tongue must be pale and the pulse must be weak. This is a very, very common type of pattern. Relatively easy to treat as well. And the formula for this is the formula I mentioned earlier. Gan Mei Ta Cao Tang, the so-called miraculous formula with the three very mild ingredients, wheat husks, black dates, and licorice, which in the three treasures I have a variation of it called Soothe the Shen. So there are three treasures formula that you can use: Breaking Clouds, Searching Soul, and Soothe the Shen. Soothe the Shen is the main one. Soothe the Shen is a variation of Gan Mei Ta Cao Tang. And again, this is the formula, and those are the three ingredients. And this formula also treats anxiety. But this will be a very mild anxiety. This slide here highlights the difference between these three formulas, all of which are for depression from deficiency. So the first works more on spleen and heart, the second more on heart, the third more on liver and heart. The second pattern is a very common pattern, much more common in women. It's a deficiency of qi and blood of the spleen, liver and heart. Extremely common pattern. Deficiency of qi and blood from what? From emotions such as sadness, grief, shame as well can cause that. Fear also can cause this. Together with some maybe dietary factors affecting this. So I repeat, it's the deficiency of qi and blood of heart, liver and spleen. So the person is depressed, the movement of the Hun is deficient, and there are many typical physical symptoms such as palpitations, pale face, dizziness. In order to diagnose this pattern, the tongue must be pale. If the tongue isn't pale, then it's not this pattern. And the formula for this is a very famous formula called Wipi Tang. Wipi Tang is a major formula, has many different applications. In the context of mental and emotional problems, it's for depression, with some anxiety as well, not very severe, but some anxiety from blood deficiency. And the equivalent of that in the three treasures is Calm the Shen. Calm the Shen is a variation of Wipi Tang. And these are all pale tongue, pale to different degrees. This is the paler of these three. That one, by the way, has a hard crack. The two top ones have a hard crack. So going back to the hard crack, what does that mean? If you look at this tongue here with the hard crack, you know that will be more difficult to treat than that. It will take longer. Heart Yang Shu, not very common, we will skip that. And we come now to heart and kidney yin deficiency with anti-heat. This would only appear in late stages of depression, someone who's been depressed for many years. Usually only middle-aged and old people, unlikely in a young person. And the tongue would look like that, not necessarily as bad as this. This is a very severe case of it. But the tongue will be two factors. One, without coating, and two, red. The lack of coating indicating yin deficiency, and the redness indicating empty heat. So this is yin deficiency of heart and kidneys with empty heat, and this is due to long-term sadness, grief from loss, also fear, and also guilt would be a very common emotional etiological factor for this. And with this pattern, besides depression, there would also be severe anxiety and insomnia. Quite severe. So if the tongue has a coating, it cannot be this pattern, because with yin deficiency you have no coating. And this formula, this pattern, has a very famous formula related to it, which is called Tian Wang Bu Xin Dan, Heavenly Emperor Tonifying the Heart Pill. And the equivalent of that in the Three Treasures is called Heavenly Empress. Corresponds to that formula. So I repeat, in this case, besides being depressed, this person is also quite severely anxious. And these are all variations of tongues related to this pattern. Notice we've seen this tongue in the earlier slide. This would be the worst case. It could also be like the two top ones, but without coating. The fifth deficiency pattern is kidney yang deficiency. That's also relatively common, especially in men. So this depression is very strongly characterized by deficiency of the zhi of the kidneys. There's this lack of energy on a physical level, and this lack of energy on a mental level. Lack of drive, enthusiasm, determination, which leads to the lack of movement of the hun. Plus some kidney symptoms, such as lower backache, frequent urination, etc. And this would also could derive from fear, from guilt as well. Guilt can do it. Sadness and grief. And the formula I use to tonify kidney yang is Yogui 1. Jingui Shenqi 1 is also a very famous formula for kidney yang, but I personally prefer Yogui 1 from Zhang Jin Yue. And the equivalent of that in the Three Treasures is strengthen the root. And this slide here summarizes the Three Treasures remedies for depression. We have discussed more or less all of them. Some for full conditions, some for empty conditions. By the way, I nearly always combine acupuncture with herbal medicine for many diseases, but especially in the mental emotional problems and in depression as well. I want to say a few words about the Dumei in the treatment of depression. And the Dumei is very important in the treatment of depression. And this diagram here illustrates why. It originates from the kidneys. The Dumei goes through the heart and enters the brain. So it treats these three structures, the kidneys, the heart, and the brain. So the zhi of the kidneys, the shen of the heart, and it treats the shen through the heart and the brain. By the way, there were doctors in Chinese medicine before the introduction of Western medicine into China who said that the shen is in the brain. So Chinese medicine did talk about the brain. So by treating the Dumei, we're treating all three of them. So it has a very important effect on depression. And how do I use the Dumei? If I want to use the Dumei, I use small intestine 3 with bladder 62. These 2 points in combination. Small intestine 3 and bladder 62 in combination in that order. Small intestine 3 first, bladder 62 second. plus one of these Dumé points. And here I've illustrated the mental emotional effect of some of these Dumé points. For example, Do11 is very good for shu conditions, deficiency conditions of depression related to the heart. Look at the symptoms, the indications of Do11. Sadness, depression, poor memory, disorientation, timidity, the hun not coming and going enough, etc. This one I use a lot, Do20 for depression, very, very much, irrespective of the pattern, because it treats the Dumé. By treating the Dumé, it treats kidneys, heart, and brain. It enters the brain. It would affect memory. And because it lifts qi, it also has a kind of a lifting effect on the shen, and therefore relieving depression. But one of the Do points that I use most is probably Do24, which is there right where the prefrontal lobe is. And is a great point because it treats both depression and anxiety. In Shen Ting, Ting is the courtyard. Shen is the Shen. And the courtyard in traditional Chinese houses was a very important part of the house because it gives visitors the first impression of the house. So, in the context of depression, this point lifts depression, but it also treats anxiety. And it makes a particularly good combination with gallbladder 13, especially for anxiety. I use the gallbladder also in depression for two reasons. One, it stimulates the movement of the hun, and we must always stimulate the movement of the hun. And two, it treats the so-called carriage. So it stimulates when the person is timid, a little bit anxious, indecisive. The gallbladder treats that. And I use only usually gallbladder 40 for that. Notice what the Su Wen says in chapter 9, an interesting view of the gallbladder. All the 11 organs depend on the decision making of the gallbladder. So it gives the gallbladder a very important role. And there are some Chinese doctors, in fact, who use it for that. They say that using the gallbladder, especially gallbladder 40, kind of activates all the other points because of that role of the gallbladder. And as I said, I use primarily gallbladder 40. And there's actually another reason why I use the gallbladder. So there are three reasons. One, stimulates movement of the hun. Two, it treats the so-called carriage and motivates all the other organs. But three, it also helps the ascending of liver qi. And I'm not talking about the pathological liver yang rising, but liver qi also needs to ascend physiologically, ascend to the heart and to the shen. And by doing that, it gives the heart and the shen that movement, that extending in relationships. And gallbladder 40 does that as well. It stimulates the physiological ascending of liver qi. This is a list of acupuncture points for depression. I'm not going to discuss all of them one by one. I would only like to perhaps highlight a few of them. And one of them that is not usually well known is lung 3. 3 zone below the axillary fold is a window of heaven point, and regulates ascending and descending of qi to and from the head. By doing that, lung 3 will stimulate the rising of clear qi to the head and the descending of turbid qi from the head, and that has a mental emotional equivalent as well. It clears thoughts and stimulates the descending of turbid qi from the head. But it is particularly good for that. Notice what this ancient book says. This is a book from the Qing dynasty, which I use a lot when I want to look up the functions of a point. And notice what it says. Lung 3 treats forgetfulness, poor memory, which is often a feature of depression, sadness and weeping due to qi not rising to the head. So it's a point I use frequently in depression, especially related to lungs and heart. For example, lungs and heart qi stagnation. Let's see another point. Yes, I'd like to say a few things about stomach 40. Most people relate stomach 40 to resolving phlegm, and they say, how do you resolve phlegm? Use stomach 40. It is true, but not as simple as that. To resolve phlegm, you need many more points than just stomach 40. So that's one thing I wanted to emphasize. It does resolve phlegm, but only in combination with many other points. But the other thing I wanted to emphasize, that stomach 40 has many other actions, and they are summarized in this diagram. It works on the stomach, of course, and I use it in all full conditions of the stomach, but notice that it acts on the chest and the heart. It relaxes the chest, opens the chest. For example, in the pattern of stagnation of qi of lungs and heart, I would use stomach 40, not to resolve phlegm, but to open the chest. And 3, stomach 40 acts on the shen, on the mind, and it calms the shen. So it's many other functions than just resolving phlegm. Calms the mind, opens the mind's orifices, all full conditions of the stomach, rebellious qi of the stomach, opens the chest. Is a great point, and especially goes well in combination with pericardium 6. For example, again, stagnation of qi of lungs and heart. And another point I wanted to talk about was bladder 47. It's on the outer bladder line. Hun Men means the door to the Hun. It's outside bladder 18, the backshoe point of the liver. And I use this point to regulate the movement of the Hun. So it would work both in depression and in mania. In depression, the movement of the Hun is deficient, and I would use this point to stimulate the movement of the Hun. But I would also use it when the person is slightly manic to restrain the movement of the Hun. Bladder 52, I've already mentioned. Again, it's on the outer line, the room of Je. I use that a lot to stimulate the Je of the kidneys in the person who's depressed, even in the absence of kidney deficiency symptoms. To stimulate initiative, drive, determination, power, strength on a physical and a mental level. Gallbladder 13 I use often in combination with Do24, particularly when the person is depressed and anxious. The combination of these 2 points is very, very effective. Do24 and Gallbladder 13 together, both depression and anxiety. And Gallbladder 13 has an interesting other function. it gathers Jing to the brain. It makes the Shen return to its root, which is the Jing. So, in a strange way, one might not expect it, this point also works on the Jing and the kidneys and the marrow. And that's another way in which it will help depression. Its name, Wen Shen, means root or root of the Shen. Notice what that dictionary of acupuncture says. This point makes the Shen return to its root being the Jing. When I say essence here, I mean Jing. So it connects the Shen and Jing, heart and kidneys. So it's a very important point for depression. This is a list of herbs for depression. How do we interpret this list? These are the kind of herbs that you would add to another formula if you were making a custom formula. For example, Ban Xia Hou Po Tang or Gan Mei Ta Cao Tang, any formula. You would add one or two of these herbs to move qi. Why do we want to move qi even if the problem is not qi stagnation? Because of the movement of the hun. We always want to stimulate the movement of the hun. So say for example you're treating someone for heart and kidney yin deficiency with empty heat, and we use Tian Wang Pu Xin Dan, which I mentioned earlier. If you make a custom formula, I would have one or two of these herbs to stimulate the movement of the hun and to move qi. And all these herbs are herbs which have a very long-standing and well-known mental emotional effect, specifically for depression. For example, this one is a very famous one. Whatever formula I was using for a person who's depressed, if I was using a custom formula, I would probably always add this one, He Huan Pi. Because even if the pattern isn't liver qi stagnation, you still want to have some movement to stimulate the movement of the hun. So this concludes my presentation, and I'd like to stress again that both acupuncture and herbs, singly or together, offer a very good treatment for depression. And by the way, both the acupuncture and the herbs can be combined with medical treatment of depression. There is no contradiction in at least temporarily combine it if the person is taking antidepressants. And as you might have noticed, some of the slides I did not discuss, but you will have a handout with all the slides. And thank you very much.